Today we have for us the interview released by Wowhead with WoW's game director, Hazzikostas, as well as the associate game director Morgan Day. This comes out as a bit of a damage control, right, as more negativity around the change to the affixes, the CC required in Mythic Plus keys, the damage coming out in Mythic Plus keys, and some of these other problems being seen in the beta. So now we have these two devs coming out to clear things up a bit. And since this is a 20 pages long interview and I don't want to embarrass any of you, but you can't read, I'm going to give you the TLDR of what was being said in these interviews to skip all of the lawyer speak and all of the fluff that doesn't actually convey anything worth of noting. The first question was about the raid and about the private auras in the raid. If you're not aware, the private aura is that raid mechanic or even dungeon mechanic which is not traceable by add-ons. Basically, you cannot put that mechanic in your weak auras, it cannot tell you what to do or give you any information about it, etc, etc. The TLDR in everything that's being said here is, yeah, we know it can be annoying to have these in a raid, but we also know that players, when they can, they will try to optimize everything out of an encounter. So we still have to try to sneak in a few private auras here and there, because whenever we think of a cool mechanic, we also realize, damn, this cool mechanic can be made trivial because of a weak aura, so we have to make it private in order to force you to actually do that mechanic properly. So their point is, yeah, we have to be careful on where we actually put them, but we can also try to squeeze them in a little bit so that it can make player decision making and creativity work nicely in a raid. So the TLDR was, yes, private auras are still going to be part of raid encounters in the War Within. The question about the difficulty of a Mirja Seal, of course, it's all related to the difficulty of Tindral and the difficulty of Farak compared to the rest of the raid. This is a whole bunch of lawyer speak, not actually saying anything. There is the usual, yeah, maybe we could have been a little bit more aggressive and nerfed these couple of bosses a little bit sooner. And a series of other generic speak like, well, you know, it's kind of hard to balance the raid because we have to range from race to world first competitors, to Wall of Fame guilds, to cutting edge guilds, to the guilds getting cutting edge right at the end of the season, etc, etc. The only possible dramatic sentence made by Ion was that they, the developers, were actually urged by a number of Wall of Fame guilds to not take heavy nerfs to Tindral and Farak. Why? Because they were enjoying the challenge. So we're not gonna go too deep into this, even though we know that the number of Hall of Fame level guilds is a couple, and they are liquid and old liquid instant dollars through their Race to World First Discord server, but we're gonna skip through that and hope that we get a slightly better balanced raid at the release of the War Within. Now there was one question which is something we have mentioned here multiple times, the question about the max item level of guilds. Basically, how fast do you get to gear through a season? This boomed out of control during Aberrus, when players basically were getting to max item level in 3 weeks because of how powerful the new upgrade gear system was. After Blizzard revamped Valor and turned it into the Crest system, players really got to max item level quickly. Again, Ion, as per usual, doesn't actually give an answer to this problem. Morgan Day does say something a little bit more interesting though. We are discussing introducing a system that is similar to the re-origination array back in Uldir, except this time it's gonna be through the quest system. Basically, essentially on a weekly basis, you will get more and more power while inside the raid, and their general cap idea for now of this power will be to make you 20% stronger in the raid. So, as a way to passively nerf the bosses over time, while also not requiring you to get that much item level that quickly, we are just gonna give you the power for you, inside the raid only, over time. That is what they are discussing about the problems of gearing up too quickly, which can of course become a problem because you might get bored, you might lose interest, for example, in farming the raid because you have no more upgrades to get from the raid, etc, etc. So it is a problem that needs fixing right now. Of course, large parts of the answers were dedicated to the Mythic Plus drama related to the change of the affixes and the way these new affixes have been let's say, received by the player base, which was not very positive. Lots of this reeks like damage control. Ion is already saying stay tuned because soon enough we will get more updates on the changes in the beta build for the affixes. So barely a week after the announcing of the initial changes to the affixes, they are, going back on them to try to fix some of the problems players have found in these affixes. The most interesting thing that is being said in here is that they think that for the average Mythic Plus player, or even the one just getting into Mythic Plus to fill the vault or for loot, they don't think that the affixes played too big of a role or become too big of an issue. They think affixes might have a much bigger issue for players pushing the very high end keys. Because, for example, it can create push weeks or it can create dead weeks where players don't even want to bother playing because they know they can't push higher than what they have already done in that key level during bolstering, for example. And the interesting part about this is Ion saying that they are discussing some solutions that may allow players who are focused on the competitive optimization and perfection aspect of the dungeon to have less randomness and variation in their week-over-week experience. So just a simple example, like as soon as you get into plus 20 level, as soon as you start getting above key level that can give you an actual reward like gear, you can, for example, select the affixes you want. Or maybe you cannot select tyrannical or fortified, but you can select the other two affixes you want, or something along these lines. Something to make players who want to push high keys have no dead weeks or have more push weeks, so they are more incentivized in playing in the Mythic Plus keys. There are also some interesting bits pointed out by Ion, like for example, according to their data, of course, an affix like Storming was considered a free affix by very high-end players, but it has considerable impact on the success rate in the lower ranges. The entire point made here is practically that when you play at low level with casuals, with scrubs, with normies, stuff that can actually kill you in the high keys is irrelevant because it's not going to kill you at that low level, like for example enraged casts or mobs healing too much from Sanguine. But trivial things at high end, things that are easily avoidable, become a bigger problem at low key level because they actually impact their characters. For example, entangling, storming, volcanic, things that they have to dodge or move out of for lower level players seem to be a bigger issue. Now, continuing to talk about Mythic Plus, the other point about Mythic Plus was the stops. So the whole concept around the requirements of crowd controls in the keys, which is also partially the reason why, for example, Vengeance Demon Hunter suddenly became so popular after their rework and the introduction of the double sigil, which is now going to be removed in the War Within. Now, for those who don't know or don't remember or just assumed it was like this forever, but it wasn't, Blizzard changed things slightly in Dragonflight. Previously, when an enemy was casting something, if they were crowd controlled with anything other than a silence, they would just go back to casting whatever they were casting. So knocking them up or knocking them away or stunning them wasn't actually going to make them stop their cast. They would simply start it right after the crowd control. In Dragonflight, they changed this to most of the mobs. Practically, if a mob was starting a cast, that ability would go on cooldown. It doesn't matter if you stopped it with a silence, with a stun, a blind, a fear, or a knockup, that ability would go on cooldown. So suddenly now, in Dragonflight, things like AoE stuns becomes much more valuable. AoE knockups, AoE fears become way more powerful because now you are effectively stopping them from casting, since their cast went on cooldown as soon as they started it. Whereas previously, even if you stun them while they were casting, right as they got outside of the stun, they would start casting again. So the TLDR of all of this is that, yeah, we are trying to tune down a bit the amount of mobs that will get their ability to go on cooldown as soon as they cast it, so that your AoE crowd control doesn't have nearly as much power, so that we put more power into things like silences and interrupts compared to now, where silences and interrupts have actually lost a lot of value compared to specs that can have these type of AoE CCs. Now, it still doesn't answer the issue, the fact that there is too many casts to stop, and right now in Mythic Plus, players are not having too good of a time with the amount of casts they are supposed to stop. Whether or not they are going on cooldown when they get crowd controlled or not is still an issue, but at least this one is a start. Then we have a depressing answer. The depressing answer is about the raid buffs, and the usual problem we have every expansion talking about the problems of trying to fill a raid with every available raid buff, and as usual, certain specs being left behind because they don't have any. It used to be rogues, hunters, DKs, and shamans. Then they gave a damage reduction raid buff to a rogue, so rogues now are also a mandatory pick. Then they gave Hunter's Mark to Hunter, which is not, a complete must-have in the raid, but it's still something. So now you're left with DK and Shaman. I am saying the answer is depressing because the answer from Ion is deal with it. I'm sorry, but deal with it. As he's saying, we are hesitant to add still more raid buffs that might risk feeling redundant, and yet another thing to manage or that might too heavily force less choice in composition forming. Remember, this interview is coming 3 to 4 months after Hunter was given a raid buff with Hunter's Mark and Rogue was given Atrophic Poison as a raid buff. So, it's an interesting take to have, given what you actually put in game. And then he even twists the knife by saying, we need to look at diversity and want to make sure that classes like Shaman and DK are bringing tools to the raid that make them valued. Yes, raid buffs is what they would need to make them valued, which is something they currently don't have. So, sad answer to the question about raid buffs to these kind of classes, still missing raid buffs. Another one of the more debated arguments was the problem around healing. Many players have gotten into this issue where healing became very powerful, so Blizzard had to spike up the damage taken so that healing actually felt impactful, to the point where most of the time, as soon as you increase the difficulty of this level, like high-level Mythic raiding early on, before the nerfs or before you have good gear, as well as high-level Mythic Plus keys, most of the very dangerous stuff turns into a one-shot. So basically, it goes past the limit where a healer is needed and just gets into a, do you have a defensive? Do you have an external? Are you tanky enough to survive or die? Blizzard did attempt to fix this mid-expansion in Dragonflight, if you remember, trying to increase the health pool of players to nerf the healing done, to make it so that it would take healers longer to top players' HP bars, so players were allowed to take more damage over time and healers had more time to react to that damage. That didn't really have much of the effect required. You still get one shot in Mythic Plus. Raids are still completely dominated by massive damage spikes requiring big cooldowns, and many healers feeling pretty weak outside of their cooldowns. And then the other frustrating problem for healers, which is the feeling that their healing doesn't matter as long as the player they are healing does not line up with their defensives. So it feels like even if I heal well, the success is still in the hands of the other players using their survivability tools correctly. So even though I'm a healer, not even 100% of the healing is up to me. Whereas as a DPS, most of the time 100% of the damage is up to you. For a healer, it's like 60 to 70% of the healing's job is up to you. Ion gives the usual diplomatic answer, yeah, this is something we are keeping a very close eye on. We are also looking at the player's self-healing across specs and role, etc, etc. But, for now, at least in the beta, no changes regarding this problem for healers. Same issue duplicated, this time not about the healing or the self-healing, but this time about the defensive creep in the game. Once again, for example, Hunter has just been reworked and they just got significantly more tanky thanks to the extra defensives they have been given. We also have some irony in here, for example, Ion saying that more defensives and self-healing tools for specs that may be a part of hybrid classes. It's funny because the tankier classes in the game for DPS are Mage and Warlock and Rogue, which are pure DPS classes, and the squishiest ones are DPS like Balanced Druid, Elemental Shaman or Enhancement Shaman, and even Devastation Evoker, which are part of hybrid classes. So that's already a pretty funny thing to say. in terms of defensive power. It seems like it's going well because Ion seems like to be getting the problem. We are keenly aware of the pressure that places on encounter design and on healing at the very end, where we need to assume the players are making use of all the tools available to them, and there's a point where if having a defensive means that all of the encounter designs have to hit you harder, because they have to assume you're using the defensive, having a defensive isn't necessarily making your life easier or better, because at that point it just becomes a background thing you have to click at certain points to just be able to stay alive in the first place. And it becomes bad, of course, because some specs have more defensives than others. So if you have 3 giga hits hitting you over the course of 2 minutes, some specs will have 3 different defensives within 2 minutes to use, others will only have 1, which will become a pretty big problem. Problem which, once again, has no answer, since in all of this, Ion doesn't actually say anything about how to fix this defensive creep problem, and neither does Morgan Day. Nobody seems to have an answer to this defensive creep problem right now in the game. Most of the other questions are not really that interesting, like the mid-expansion release of augmentation, the visual clarity problems, or perhaps things like visual filters. The one important one was the question about the AoE cap introduced in Battle for Azeroth and then continued in Shadowlands. There is not much to say. Are there any plans to look at the AoE caps? No, there aren't. The caps are staying to 5 to 8 targets, soft caps, hard caps, scaling caps up to 20 targets, etc, etc. They are still going to stay in the next expansion. That was pretty much the last of the relevant questions in terms of interesting things, especially related to, to combat, to mechanics, to specs and raids and Mythic Plus, etc, etc. So these were the points through the interview given by Hazzikostas and Morgan Day about the current state of their plans, I guess, in the beta, in the changes they are planning to give to the game, although as usual many of these questions had mostly just fluff, smoke, and not real distinct answers. We did get some answers here and there, more or less about what you would expect from a developer. So with this out of the way, we're now done on this Thursday recapping this interview from the WoW devs related to how things are going development-wise for the War Within. So, with this done with, hoping that I saved to you 1 hour of reading all through this for mostly just disappointment, we can now leave each other. We are starting, of course, the goodbyes by everyone who is supporting for free by liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, yes, it's 29 degrees and it's quite hot. You guys in your cardboard houses wouldn't understand what this means.